Welcome to the Indiana Jones Lorecast, where we delve into the lore and the history of the Indiana Jones franchise. Hello everyone, and welcome to the show. This episode will be sort of a brief overview of Indiana Jones himself, the character, and how it all started. We'll be going over how the character came to be, discussing both the birth of the character in real life, as well as the literal birth of the character in universe, a brief look at his childhood, and looking a bit into his adult years. But I hear you all asking, but Sir Bandit, you devilishly handsome academic you, why wasn't this the first episode of the show? And, well, first of all, thank you, I appreciate the comment, but the reason why is I wanted the show to begin by leaping straight into the action. You get to see Indy go on an adventure and get to know his character and what he can do, just to set the bar for the kinds of adventures that there are to be had, more or less. By the way, if you've checked out those first two episodes, thank you very much. And I suppose you can think of those episodes as a cold open to the show, effectively making the cold open to those episodes the cold open to the cold open. But anyway, now that we've covered a full adventure of his, beginning to end, I wanted to rewind a bit to look at his beginnings. So first, let's look at how the concept of this character came together, and for that, we'll have to go back a few decades. The year is 1977, and two men sit on a beach in Hawaii. These two men are George Lucas and Steven Spielberg. Lucas, for years, had wanted to create a story that was in essence a modern fairy tale, with the vibe of a sort of Saturday morning serial adventure. Serials are essentially sequential installments of a story. The two ideas that he had for this was either a sci-fi space adventure and then a story about an archaeologist who would go around the world looking for ancient artifacts and have a sort of supernatural flavor to them from time to time. Now, that sci-fi idea of his ended up becoming a small film called Star Wars. It's kind of niche, not many people have heard about it. So, while work was being done on Star Wars, the archaeologist idea was shelved. And just to go back to that idea that George Lucas had to make it a sort of serial adventure, that's one of the reasons why the franchise is so fun to me, is because it very much does feel like a serial sort of adventure, just these small installments of the same character or characters doing wildly different things at times, from episode to episode. It very much does feel like something that you'd sit down on a Saturday morning, it comes on the TV and you just have a good time watching it. It's very much that sort of, on this week's episode, the character does this, and, it's some insane thing, and it's fun. That's just the overall point here. It really just is so fun. So, now back to the beach. Lucas and Spielberg had planned this vacation together, and were sitting, discussing film projects and the success of Star Wars: A New Hope, which had just come out. And Lucas then asks Spielberg about his projects, what's he busy with and what does he want to work on, stuff like that. And Spielberg tells George Lucas that he has always wanted to direct a James Bond film. And so Lucas tells him that, well, he has a better idea. And he then tells Spielberg about this adventurous archaeologist of his and the vision that he has for it. And Spielberg liked the idea. And from that moment, plans were put in place for them to make not just one film, but a series of films eventually, about their own original action hero. And so, we have the birth of Indiana Smith. Yes, Indiana Smith was the name of this character, but Spielberg wasn't fond of the name Smith. So then they decided, well, alright, then we'll just call him Indiana Jones. And they went with that. They decided that the films were going to use a lot of practical effects and old school tricks and techniques, quick and dirty type stuff, the way the TV shows were filmed. Not spend a lot of time on one shot and, just with the use of practical effects, and it also reduced the budget heavily, which was a huge factor in the film's success. So this played a big part in the overall atmosphere of the franchise as well. Another factor which contributed heavily to the success of the character is the casting. After a few test screenings, they eventually landed on using none other than Harrison Ford for the role, and his portrayal of the character added, in my opinion, the perfect blend of charm, seriousness, action, and humor that Indiana Jones needed. And combine that with a great supporting cast, a soundtrack by the one and only John Williams, and what came of it? An iconic and legendary story. When the first film, Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, premiered on June 12, 1981, it became the highest grossing film of the year. I personally didn't go see it in theaters, as I did not exist, but many did, and the character pretty much became an instant icon, with his hat and the leather jacket, the whip, the satchel, the revolver. It's all just so cool. But before I freak out too much about how cool his equipment is, we are going to hop over quickly to the mid-show break. I'll see you all there.
Snakes. Why did it have to be snakes?
Why hello there, and welcome to the mid-show break. This is a section in the middle of the episode for me to quickly discuss the show itself and any other relevant info. Firstly, hi, I'm your host, Kel, or Sir Bandit, and thank you very much for tuning in. If you're enjoying the show, you can support it by leaving a rating or review on whatever platform you listen on, as it really helps the show reach more people. I will also be using this segment to read out any 5-star reviews from Apple Podcasts. So if you rate the show 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and leave a review along with it, I will be reading it out on the show in a future episode. And if you'd like to reach out, please feel free to do so. You can find me on the Robots Radio Discord, where there is a dedicated channel for this very show. It's our own little corner of the Robots Radio community. So if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions that you want to throw my way, or if you just want to nerd out over how cool the movies are and discuss the franchise, or hey, if you just want to fangirl over Harrison Ford's charming smirk, then you're more than welcome. We'd love to see you there. So without any further delay, let's get on with the episode.
I'm going after that truck. How? I don't know. I'm making this up as I go.
So now that we have discussed the birth of Indy in a conceptual sense, let us now move on to the birth of Indy in the in-universe sense. And don't worry, I will not actually be describing the literal birth itself. It'll just be the broad strokes of his early life and upbringing. On the 1st of July, 1899, Henry Walton Jones Jr. is born in Princeton, New Jersey, to parents Henry Walton Jones Sr. and Anna Mary Jones. In his early childhood, the family gets a dog, an Alaskan Malamute named Indiana. Henry and Indiana grow up together and become inseparable over the years, and Henry, due to his fondness of the dog, decides to adopt the name Indiana for himself as a nickname. And a quick bit of trivia for the name itself here: Indiana, the dog, is actually a real dog. George Lucas owned an Alaskan Malamute named Indiana, which inspired the character name in real life as well for George Lucas. So pretty cool meta dog information there. The childhood of Indiana Jones is largely covered by the TV series The Young Indiana Jones Chronicles. The show was later re-edited and re-released as The Adventures of Young Indiana Jones. So just to avoid confusion between the two, they are essentially the same show, just with a few added in scenes and reordered things, but it is largely the same. There is also a series of Young Indiana Jones novels which describe further adventures which are not depicted in the series. So, just to point out a few things here from his childhood, at the age of 7, Indy, while at a traveling circus, sees an act involving whips. It's like a whip act. And this instilled in him a fascination with whips, bull whips, and so we know where that leads. Indy's father is a professor of medieval literature and an author, and when Indy is around 9 years old, one of his father's books becomes very successful, and this leads to his father getting the opportunity to travel and give lectures at different colleges and universities around the world. Indy and his mother accompany him, so Indy at a very young age gets to experience world travel and learns of many different cultures and places. His father also instills in him a love of history and knowledge, and throughout his childhood he also learns to speak other languages, such as Latin. In the year 1912, so when he was around 13 years old, while on a Boy Scout trip, Indy comes across a gang of grave robbers, stealing an artifact called the Cross of Coronado. It's like this big, crucifix-looking thing. He manages to take it from the gang, and a chase ensues through the Utah desert on horseback. He unfortunately was not able to get the cross from the gang, as they caught up and reclaimed it. But the leader of this gang, impressed by young Indy's spirit and skill, gives him his fedora. This is the iconic fedora which Indy wears for his whole life. So there is more to this particular story, but we will be covering it in more detail in a future episode. So overall, you have this really cool base for a character like this, to know so much and have experienced so much from so early in life, of course, has a profound impact on a person. And remember, this is just a very brief telling of those years of his life, but there are many stories that take place during his younger years that are worth telling. But again, we will be covering some of them in future episodes. Moving on to his adult years, he of course gets his education and becomes a professor and begins his teaching career, alongside his constant adventures. This life has its dangers though. So throughout his career, he has come up against grave robbers, criminal gangs, cults, hostile tribes from all around the world, as well as groups such as the Nazis, the Soviets, and Imperial Japan during the years surrounding the World Wars and the Cold War. Indy also served in the military during the World Wars. He has actually served in more than one military, namely the French and Belgian armies. But in the US military, he ends up holding the rank of colonel and undertakes many dangerous missions and operations. These will also show up in more detail in later episodes. But even outside of the theater of war, his expeditions and adventures are no less exciting and dangerous. You'd be really hard-pressed to point to anywhere on a world map that he has not visited at some point. There are other details which are certainly notable in his life, such as marriages and his children, stuff like that, but those will all end up being discussed at some point when the relevant stories come up. So, this episode is a strange one, because it is sort of a character deep dive, but the whole show is pretty much one giant character deep dive when it comes to Indy himself, him being the protagonist. So I wanted to give some quick snippets of information to give a basic understanding of what he's done and how he became who he is in later years without going too deep into each individual story, as again we will be getting to that eventually. So, I suppose my goal for this episode was to give a brief introduction to the character for anybody who might not know how the idea of Indiana Jones came about, or how he became the person he is, with the career that he ended up with in the franchise. And I know I briefly touched on his life and everything in about 2 sentences in the introduction episode to the show, but I wanted to actually dedicate an episode to that, because I didn't want anybody who didn't know the character, all 3 of you, to be watching or rather listening to the episodes and sort of going, okay, this is all cool, but who is this guy? Like, how is he? Why does he use a whip? What, he's a teacher, but why is he doing all this then? It's just sort of giving you the basics here. So obviously we will be, as I've said about 22,000 times in this episode, be covering all these stories that I've mentioned here in far more detail in the future, but this is a good place to go, I suppose, for anybody who just wants to sort of get a basic rundown of Indiana Jones and why we love him so much. And sure, we may all love the character, but when you actually take a close look and consider it, you'd be surprised at just how unique and iconic Indiana Jones actually is. And one of the reasons that he is so iconic and unique to me is the fact that he isn't really the typical action hero. You have to remember the first film released in the 80s, and when you picture an 80s action hero, your mind conjures an image of some hulking army soldier smoking a cigar while mowing down dozens of enemies with a heavy machine gun of some kind, which is very cool, of course, not throwing any shade here, but Indiana Jones was different. He certainly felt more like the average guy. We see him tired, we see him bested at times, we see him get knocked onto his backside, several times in fact, and it all feels very human. That is the end result of all of this. And we also get to see other parts of his life. We watch him teaching classes and deciphering ancient languages and being, for lack of better words, a nerd. We get to see him be a true academic alongside all the crazy stuff he does. So all of this makes it all the more exciting when he does get into a life and death confrontation, and we see him do something crazy and daring in order to best his enemies. There is also the fact that he sometimes comes out on top, not due to being the strongest, but by using his wits or even fighting dirty at times in order to overcome the overwhelming odds. I just love looking back on things like this and how they were first conceptualized. Seeing the idea for a character like this take form and knowing what it would become is just so cool. It's so cool to me. But that is as deep as I want to dive for now. If you have enjoyed this small taste of Indiana Jones's life story, then stick around for future episodes where we will cover many of his notable adventures and accomplishments. And thank you guys so much for listening. I hope that you all have a great week, and I will see you in the next one. And if you have any questions, you can find me in my office. But until then, remember, stealing an ancient artifact from someone will either win you a cool hat or a prison jumpsuit. Either way, your wardrobe will get an upgrade, so I guess it's up to you to weigh the pros and cons for that one. I'll see you all next time. Thanks for listening to the Indiana Jones Lorecast. If you like what you hear and want to support the show, drop a rating or review wherever you're listening. I'll see you next time.